I'm taking the subframe out of the car, so I need to support the motor somehow because the motor mounts are attached to the subframe. What we have here is a little engine support system connected to the shock towers of the car, and then we have the ratchet straps going around the motor mounts, and that is holding the motor in the air while I disconnect the motor mounts. Okay, I'm gonna remove this rack skid plate. There's 2 17 mils and 6 14 mils that I see so far. So we have a high pressure feed line that looks to be a 12 mil flared nut and a return line that is a hose slipped over with a spring clamp. Now I'm ready to unbolt the rack and unbolt the suspension, so I can work on either of those next. So now I'm gonna remove the outer tie rod, and we're gonna work on getting the rack out all as one unit with the tie rods. I'm gonna disconnect them from the knuckle. It's 2 19 mil fasteners. So now I'm going to remove the steering shaft from the steering rack. It connects the steering wheel to the steering rack. It's just a couple of U-joints. I think it's a 12 mil fastener holding it down. I'm gonna disconnect the steering rack. It looks to be 4 17 mil bolts holding it from the bottom. That was a nut and bolt going through the rack into the subframe. I just had to reach around to the top and get that 19 mil nut on top of the rack, and it was held in with a 17 mil head bolt. So I want to have the trans jack just supporting the weight of this rack while I tap the steering shaft out of it. Okay, so it looks to be there's a bolt going through this brace into the subframe with a nut on top. Both 14 mil heads. I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. We have the engine double supported just for double the safety. Up top, we have the engine support held in with the bar and the ratchet straps holding onto the motor mounts. And below here, just in case, we have the motor held up with the jack stand here, just being supported on the lower oil pan flange. Now I'm gonna disconnect the engine motor mounts and the subframe bolts, and then hopefully drop the subframe. The motor mount, and then this stud, and then this stud, and it should drop. I'm gonna disconnect the engine mounts from the subframe first. Now I'm going to remove the bolts from the cross member attaching to the frame. Okay, I'm gonna start lowering it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to cutting the subframe to fit this relocation bracket. I'll show you too. So this holds the rack in. It bolts to the subframe with these points, and it holds the rack with these points. If you hold it up to where it goes, what we need to do is cut it right shy of the motor mounts, and this will sit flush into the subframe and hold the rack in this location right here. Cam and I are gonna try it with the bandsaw, and if that doesn't work, we're gonna use the good old Sawzall. All right, so we got this subframe prepared for the rack relocation kit. What we did was we cut out this center section of the subframe with the bandsaw. You can easily replicate it at home with a Sawzall and a Sawzall blade. Just cut down the sides here. After that cut was done, we had to make some modifications further to fit the rack. So what we had to do was we had to cut this extra rib off here that fits the steering shaft. And then we had to shave away this portion here that cleared for the sheet metal in the plate. And then we had to cut out this section right here. It was a hump that protruded about that much, and we shaved it down to allow for the inner tie rod clearance on the rack. Once it's moved forward, it needed more clearance towards this rib area. And once we have all that shaved down, we can install the rack relocation kit and the rack and everything back in the car. I'm gonna use the OEM M8 125 fasteners. It used to hold down the little rack skid plate, and now we're gonna use it to hold down this relocation plate. And also there is some M10 125 nuts that go back here. We can just reuse the OEM ones as well. Okay, so with the front rack relocation, we need to delete this speed sensor. What it does is it controls the amount of fluid that goes to the rack, and it increases and decreases the amount of effort needed to turn the steering wheel. So at slow speeds, it'll increase the aid of steering the car, and at high speeds, it'll decrease the aids. When you're cruising at high speeds, you need less steering effort. So for drifting, the car is going fast and we're steering a lot, so we need a lot of steering assist at high speed. So it's the opposite of what the OEM intended this for. What we do is we take this sensor off and we put a plug in this port, and you'll unplug the sensor. To make sure our steering rack and steering wheel is straight together, we can measure the ends of these rams and make sure that they're even on both sides. And then we will move up to the car and center the steering wheel, and then we'll line up the shaft with that groove in the center of the shaft for the bolt to go through. And that should ensure that your rack and steering wheel are perfectly straight with each other.
And that concludes the installation of our 370Z G37 rack relocation kit. The benefits of doing this are it's going to prevent over-centering, which is one of the most important things to correct on a rear rack car. The 370 and many other Nissans are all rear rack cars, meaning they over-center easily, and the goal is to move the rack as far forward as possible to prevent that. So we've moved this rack 42 millimeters forward, which is about as far as you can go before the boot and the bolts start scraping each other. So as you can see in this location, the steering rack is now located very close to where the control arm bolt is. And we did have to do a little bit of shaving, but it's made this kit so much better. So without the rack relocation, the rack is usually located around here. The tie rod angle is horrible. It usually runs into the wheel or gets very close, and you'd reach a point where you're over center, so the wheel actually gets stuck at lock. But with the rack relocated forward, we now have a nice angle here still, and it's going to prevent this from ever over centering, and you're always going to have control at high angle. The other thing that it does is it replaces those rubber bushings that are located in the rack. Rubber bushings at high angle deflect a ton, and removing those is one of the most important things. And then last but not least, getting rid of offset rack spacers is going to increase the life of your rack. Offset rack spacers put an offset load on a ram. It's going to wear your bushings, your bearings, the rack and pinion and everything else, and you'll have premature failures. Doing this is going to make sure that your rack lasts a long time. The kit also includes a speed sensitivity delete fitting that replaces the electronic valve in the rack, so it gives you full pressure on the steering rack at all times. Thank you guys for watching this install. This product will be available when this video is dropped. So you guys will be able to easily install this, modify it yourself, and correct all of these things with the 370Z.